Hello, welcome everyone to this 1 hour webinar on how to build a strong implementation project application.
I guess we
We're
could start.
thrilled to see folks coming in. We'll give it maybe another few little minutes before we get started, but we do have a packed agenda, so I'll wait another few moments and then we'll get started. Welcome everyone. Bienvenue tout le monde. So let's get started. I'm seeing folks trickle in. That's awesome. We're thrilled to see you attending. My name is Agathe and I am the outreach advisor. And today I'm joined by my colleague Taryn, who is the funding advisor for the Adaptation in Action funding stream. And Taryn will be facilitating the second portion of this webinar. And working their magic in the backstage are my colleagues Anne-Charlotte, Mohamed, who are on the production side of things, and my colleague Charlene, who will be helping to monitor questions in the chat. So, the objective of today's webinar is to help you feel ready to submit an implementation project to the Adaptation in Action funding stream. So in today's webinar, we'll walk through the application process, we'll flag common pitfalls, and we'll highlight what makes a strong application stand out. And if you're not ready to apply just yet, that's no problem. You'll leave knowing where you can find the support and info you need. So before we dive in, a few housekeeping items to get through. So today's event will be taking place in English and in French, with simultaneous interpretation available in both languages. To join the English interpretation, you can click the interpretation bottom in the lower right of your screen. It's a little globe, and then click on English. Aujourd'hui, nous avons des présentations en français et en anglais. Si vous souhaitez écouter en français, veuillez cliquer sur le bouton d'interprétation en bas à droite de votre écran. C'est un petit globe. Et ensuite, vous sélectionnez l'option française. We also have two separate slide decks, one in English and one in French. So if you just see the options at the top of your screen, and you can switch between both. So one is the English presentation and one is the French presentation. And as we move through our presentation today, I ask that you submit your questions in the Q&A box as they come up in French or in English. And we'll address them during the overall Q&A period at the end. And my colleague Charlene will also be able to answer some of them directly in the chat. And you are welcome to submit your question in the language of your choice. All right, so this beautiful body of water that we see up on the screen now is a photo that I took this weekend. It's not too far from where I live. It's Lake Negani Gichigami, which is the Anishinaabe word for what is colonially known as Lake Ontario. And this beautiful body of water is connected to a complex system of rivers and streams. And some translations attribute the meaning of Takarano, so the Mohawk word for Toronto, as a place of submerged trees, which is said to refer to the wooden rods that were used as fishing weirs in the local river systems. And many of which of those river systems now lie beneath our paved roads that we travel daily if you're in this area. So today I'm joining you from my home in Takarono, the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississauga of the Credits, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and is now home to many diverse First Nation, Inuit, and Métis peoples. And as part of today's webinar, I'd like to share a fact sheet that was produced by FCM that highlights how integrating an Indigenous lends and Indigenous knowledge into climate strategy can enhance resilience and strengthen environmental strategies, as well as contribute to broader goals of reconciliation. And I'll just paste it in the chat here. Here we go. All right, and on the next slide, we'll see our agenda for today. Whenever you're ready for the agenda. Awesome. I'm seeing it up on the screen now. Fantastic. So again, this is a 1 hour webinar. It's separated kind of in two parts. So in the first section, we'll be addressing the what. So what is the funding offer? What kind of funding is available? What types of projects can we support? So we'll take a moment to get situated within the offer. And in the second part, we'll dive into the how. So looking at how to submit a strong application, how to avoid some of the common pitfalls and such. And once we've looked at the what and the how, we'll then have a short period of rapid fire Q&A. And to anchor ourselves in today's session, I'd like to start with a little moment of reflection. And that'll just be on the next slide. You'll be prompted to get your minds kind of activated. Um, so I'd like to invite you. I'll just wait a second here while we get the Mentimeter up. Okay. It seems like we might have some difficulties with the Mentimeter. I will prompt you with a question, and if you feel so inclined, would invite you to type your answer in the chat. So again, to anchor us in today's session, I'd like you to take a moment to picture your community in the year 2040. What might be different in your community? Are the summers maybe hotter? Is there flooding in areas that perhaps never used to flood before? Or do things just feel a little less predictable? And now I'd invite you to think ahead. If your community could focus on one thing to be better prepared for these changes, what should it be? So I'm seeing that the Mentimeter is posted in the chat. We can, if you'd like to click on the Mentimeter and put your answer there. Also welcoming answers in the chat, whatever is easiest for you. And I will myself click on the Mentimeter as well to see what is coming here. Okay, awesome. Just going to look at the screen here. Awesome. Yeah, I'm seeing lots of great answers here come through. I have drought prepared, resilient, thriving, hotter parks and recreation spaces. That is great. Thank you. Thank you everyone for engaging in this little anchoring moment. And this is really a nice segue into our offer. So our offer is really designed to support different climate priorities, understanding that these priorities vary greatly across the landscape. And I'll just like to take a step back for a second and situate ourselves and the adaptation and action funding stream within our larger initiative. So the Local Leadership for Climate Adaptation, LLCA, you'll hear the acronym floating around, is designed around three axes. So the first one is the climate ready plans and processes, which focuses on the planning side of things. the adaptation in action axis, which focuses on the implementation of adaptation actions. And finally, the last one, financing adaptation, which looks into new financing models for climate adaptation. And for today's webinar, you'll see it kind of pop up in a little red box. We'll focus on the adaptation in action stream. And this stream is to help communities move from planning to action. So it's intended for communities who are already aware of their climate risks and know which projects will help them make the greatest strides in improving their climate resilience. And this means that to be eligible for this offer, and you'll see another little pop-up on the screen here, so to be eligible for this offer, your community must have completed a climate adaptation plan or a climate risk assessment. So communities that have not completed this will be ineligible. However, if there is funding available to complete such documents, so if your community hasn't done a climate adaptation plan or a climate risk assessment, I'd invite you to have a look at the Climate Ready Plans and Processes Funding Initiative. Awesome. So at the heart of adaptation in action, which our webinar is all about today, it's a funding stream to support equity-informed climate adaptation action. So there's two types of projects that are eligible for funding under this funding stream. So we can support feasibility studies. So this is for communities that are looking to assess the viability of their proposed climate adaptation project. We can also support implementation projects for communities that are ready to execute their climate resilient project. So kind of two ways here, 2 points of entry. And this is a bit of a pick your own adventure, I'd say. So you can start at the feasibility study, or if you've completed a feasibility study previously, then you can hop right into the implementation project. And for today's session, we'll focus mostly on implementation projects. And if you were scratching your head when I was mentioning that this offer is designed to support equitable climate adaptation, and if you're wondering, what does that mean? What does equitable climate adaptation mean? I would highly encourage you to check out two great resources on why equity matters in municipal climate adaptation to get started on understanding why this work matters. And thanks so much for posting the links in the chat there, Ansha. All right, so back to our two different types of projects that adaptation and action can support, so feasibility studies and implementation projects. Just to give you a kind of a snapshot of what the funding looks like for both of those types of projects. So for feasibility study, one thing that's very important to keep in mind is that the end product should flow directly into an implementation project, meaning that your feasibility study should serve as kind of the blueprint to your implementation project. The cost share for feasibility studies starts at an 80%, and our max contribution is of 70,000. For implementation projects, it's a little bit different. So for implementation project, what you really have to keep in mind here is that the project that you're proposing will have the immediate potential to reduce climate risks. So the cost share here starts at 60% and can be increased up to 100% based on if your project meets some of the strategic priorities. And Taryn will be speaking to that a little bit later. So you'll hear more about that. One thing that's very important to note for the implementation projects is that your project must not exceed $1 million in costs. So if your project is, for example, 1.6 million, it will not be eligible under this funding stream. It really has to be designed under that 1 million to fit under that $1 million threshold. Awesome. Okay, in the next few slides, I'll switch to French. Um, donc, quelques considérations ici à prendre en compte pour les municipalités du Québec. Donc, en attendant un accord avec le MAMACH, on invite les municipalités québécoises qui souhaitent déposer leur
With
projet à le faire avec une
MAMH,
entité non municipale.
we invite Quebec
Donc, qu'est-ce que ça
municipalities
veut
to
dire?
submit a
Concrètement,
proposal
c'est que si votre municipalité
through a
souhaite déposer un
non-municipal
projet,
entity. What does that mean?
elle
If
devra
your
le faire en
municipality wants
collaboration
to
avec une entité
propose
non
a project,
municipale.
you
Donc,
need
par
to do it
exemple, un
with
conseil
a
régional de
non-municipal
l'environnement,
entity. For
un
example,
organisme de
a
base
regional
intéressant,
environmental
etc.
council,
Et puis, toute mise à
watershed
jour en
organization,
lien
and every
avec l'accord
update
avec le MAMACH
uh,
sera
uh,
publiée là, sur notre
in
site web.
the framework of the
Puis voir là,
agreement
les mêmes
with the
informations. Puis en ce moment, on a
MAMH will
l'exemple
be
et
on
on a
our
également
website. You can see
sur
the
notre site web.
information on the screen.
Super. Donc, sur cette diapo, c'est pour vous présenter
So
que
this
afin
next
de
slide
préserver le financement pour
shows you
l'ensemble des
that to
municipalités,
protect
on a établi un
funding for
nombre
all of the
maximal de projets
municipalities,
admissibles.
we
Donc, par exemple,
developed
si votre
a number that
municipalité,
is
elle est
the
de moins de
maximum number of
50 000
municipalities.
habitants, vous êtes
And what
éligible
kind of
jusqu'à
municipality?
un
If
projet de
your
mise en
municipality has
œuvre
less than
et un
50,000
projet, une
people,
étude de
you
faisabilité, pardon.
you have the
Ce qu'il
right
faut
to
bien noter
one
aussi, c'est que ces
implementation
informations
project and
ne
one
constituent pas
feasibility
une garantie.
study. But of
C'est-à-dire
course,
que
this
tous
is
les
not
projets doivent
guaranteed.
satisfaire les
Every
critères
project, of course, has to
d'admissibilité
respond
et
to
obtenir aussi
the
là, une
criteria
note
for
compétitive ou qualificatrice pour
eligibility
les
and
projets
needs
là,
to
de mise en
receive
œuvre.
a competitive grade
Donc, je vous
uh,
invite aussi, quand vous
as part
discutez
of the
du projet que
evaluation
vous souhaitez
process. So when you're discussing the
soumettre
kind of
pour
project you want
financement,
to
donc
submit for
de considérer là,
funding, to
aussi là, le
take into
nombre
account
de
the
projets
number
admissibles.
of admissible or acceptable projects according to the criteria.
Super. Donc, on est
Great.
présentement dans un appel à
So
projet.
we
Donc,
are currently
je suis bien
in
contente de voir
an
plusieurs
intake
d'entre
period,
vous
and I'm glad to see that
aujourd'hui au
many of you are
webinaire.
here today
On
at the
espère là,
webinar.
que vous
Those of
allez
you who
certainement en
have
tirer
submitted
profit
proposals,
de ce
hopefully you will be
webinaire-là
able
pour
to
préparer votre
take advantage of the
demande.
information offered to
Donc,
you
présentement,
to
on
get
accepte
your proposal ready.
les
We
demandes
are
d'études de faisabilité.
accepting
Donc, entre le 8 juillet
proposals for
jusqu'au
feasibility
29
studies
octobre.
from July 8th to October
Ce qui
29th.
est à savoir aussi
And what you
pour
need
les
to
études de
know as
faisabilité,
well for these
c'est
feasibility
qu'on
studies,
fonctionne sur la base du
we
premier arrivé,
work on the
premier
basis
servi
of
pour les études
first
de
come, first
faisabilité.
served for these
Donc, c'est-à-dire
feasibility
qu'en
studies. That
fonction
means that
de la demande qu'on
uh,
reçoit,
depending on
ça se
the
pourrait que l'appel à
demand,
projet termine plus tôt
the
pour les études de
intake
faisabilité.
period might
Donc, je vous
end
inviterais
sooner
à, dès
than
que
what's listed there.
votre
So I
demande elle
would
est complète
encourage you,
pour
once
l'étude de
your
faisabilité, je vous inviterais à la
request is
soumettre
ready, I would
dès que possible.
invite you to submit it as
Pour
soon as
l'appel à
possible.
projet, pour des projets de
For
mise en œuvre, donc on
implementation
en a deux.
projects,
Le
in fact,
premier
there are
appel
two
à projet
calls. The first
pour
call number
les projets de mise
one,
en œuvre, donc
for
jusqu'au
implementation
19 août,
projects will continue until the
et un second
19th
appel à
of
projet
August,
qui
and there'll
aura
be a
lieu
second
du 20
call
août au
from the
9
20th of
octobre.
August to the 9th of
Important à noter
October.
ici,
It's
c'est que
important to
chaque
note
appel
here that each
dispose de son propre
call
budget,
has its own
c'est-à-dire que les
budget.
projets sont évalués
So
indépendamment
the
dans le cadre
projects
de
will be
chaque appel.
evaluated
Donc, les projets,
independently
par exemple, qui
within
sont
a
soumis dans
call.
l'appel à projet
So
1
a,
ne seront pas en
projects from
concurrence
call
avec
one won't
ceux
compete against
de
projects
l'appel à
in
projet 2.
round two. That's important for you to
Donc, encore une
know.
fois, dès que vos projets
And so once
sont prêts, je vous
again,
encourage
I
à
encourage you to submit your
les
projects as
envoyer.
soon
Donc,
as they're
ça va me faire
ready,
plaisir de vous guider dans les prochaines
to submit
étapes.
them as quickly as possible, and we'll be able to assist you in the next steps.
Super. Donc, si vous débutez
Great.
dans le domaine de
So
l'adaptation
if you are
climatique,
fairly
si c'est un
new to the
nouveau
climate
champ pour vous
adaptation
et vous
space,
posez des
this is a new
questions
area
par
for
rapport
you.
à quoi ça peut ressembler un
You're just
projet de
starting
mise
to
en
wrap your
œuvre
head
dans ce
around
domaine-là,
what an implementation
je vous
project can
inviterai à
look like.
consulter une
I
ressource
would invite you to
que
consult a
mes collègues
resource
dans l'équipe de
that
renforcement des capacités ont développé.
my colleagues
C'est
at the
un outil en
capacity
ligne
development
qui est
team
très utile qui vous permet d'explorer
have
les mesures
created. It's a
concrètes
fantastic web-based
que
tool
votre
to identify
municipalité, que
actions your
votre
community
communauté
can
peut
take to
prendre pour
address
répondre à certains risques
climate
climatiques.
risks.
Ces actions sont
And these
regroupées
actions
par
are
thème,
organized
ce qui facilite la
thematically
navigation, puis
so
qui
you
vous
can
permet
explore
aussi là,
options that
d'allier
align with
les
your area of
potentielles mesures de
focus
mise en œuvre
and
avec vos domaines
current
d'intervention.
priorities.
Et maintenant,
And
je vais
now
continuer à parler en
I'm
anglais pour
going
la
to switch
reste de
back
la
to
présentation.
English for
Mais
the
encore une
rest
fois, je vous
of
invite,
the
si vous avez des
presentation. But of course,
questions,
I encourage
à
you,
vous
if you have
soumettre, à les mettre dans le chat et
questions
vous pouvez le
in
faire
either
en
language,
français.
please feel free to type them in the chat box.
Okay, great. So now that we've situated ourselves a little bit within the funding offer, I'd like to take a moment to show some examples of projects that were approved in this previous round of funding for implementation projects. So the three projects that you see up on the screen were, as I mentioned, approved in our last intake. And so they're looking at different methods to address the same climate hazard. So on this slide, we're looking at flooding as being the climate hazard that's addressed. And so one of the project comes to us from the village of Teslin in the Yukon that looks at the construction of a dike to reduce flooding with some tree planting as well as part of the project. We also have a project coming from the city of Quebec, which looks at the development of sponge parks to help manage stormwater runoff. So for those on the call that are from Quebec, this project was done or was submitted by the Conseil régional de l'environnement de la capitale nationale in partnership with the city of Quebec. And another one that comes to us from the East Coast, so Annapolis Royal, is looking at restoring a shoreline by removing a storm armor and planting native salt marsh species to reduce coastal flooding exposure. And just to give you another example here that illustrates the flexibility of the offer, is two different projects that address the climate hazard of extreme temperatures. So as you can see with these examples, so one of us comes from Saskatoon, so looking at retrofitting spray pads for water conservation and heat preparedness. And another project comes to us from the West Coast, so installing cooling station in the Sanish Peninsula. So there's a whole list, I believe, that my colleague has posted in the chat of projects that were approved in our last funding round. So if you'd like to go browse some examples of municipalities across Canada that have approved projects. Great. Quiz time. We didn't tell you that there was going to be a quiz, keeping it as a surprise. But just a little moment here to see how we're doing in terms of content. So perfect. Thank you, Ansha, for setting that up. So I'd first like to ask you, which of these three projects do not fall within the scope of the Adaptation in Action funding stream? Right, I'm seeing some folks already answering. That's awesome. If you need the link to the Mentimeter, it is in the chat. Great. Give it a few more seconds. Oh, and I think I can see the number of folks that are in the Mentimeter. That's awesome. Maybe I'll leave it a little bit longer. Hey, that's great. I'm seeing a diversity of answers here. Okay. So the answer is Um, so number three, what falls out of scope is a planning document. Yeah, thank you, Ansha, for pointing that out. So planning document that's specifically looking at climate risks. So great job. Great job, everyone. So again, adaptation and action is designed to support many different types of climate priorities, but not planning documents like a climate risk assessment or a climate adaptation plan. That can be supported through another funding stream that's the climate ready plans and processes. All right, and we have another one, just one last one for you. And I believe I will read this question out in French. Should I read it out in French? I believe so.
Non,
Okay.
pas besoin.
Non,
C'était
pas besoin.
celle-là,
Ok.
ouais.
Merci. Okay. Folks seem to be a bit shyer for that one. Okay. Well, we'll stop it here and just to say that that's exactly it. So, folks that responded, you have given good advice to your colleague that wants to apply to the adaptation and action implementation stream, which is to revise the scope so the total project cost doesn't exceed 1 million. All right. Awesome. Thanks everyone for engaging in this short little quiz. So we're already at almost the midpoint of our webinar today, and we're entering the second part. So at the start of the webinar, I mentioned that we would be looking at the what. So we've now situated ourselves within the funding offer, and now we're going to look at the how. So how to submit a strong application. And this section is going to be divided in three parts, essentially. The first part, we're going to look at the application process and required documents, then the key considerations for a strong application, and the common pitfalls to avoid. All right, so for those wondering what the application process looks like, so there's a few different steps. The first one I would encourage you to do is to have a look at our website. So on the Adaptation in Action homepage, there is a readiness check. So that is a great tool that's available on our website to see if your project meets the basic requirements in order to consider applying. So I'd highly recommend checking out that tool. And also taking advantage of the fact that our staff is here to support. So we have an entire dedicated outreach team to help you navigate the funding offer, point you to resources, and support you through your application process. And once you're feeling comfortable and familiarized with the funding offer, we then invite you to submit a pre-application through our funding portal. And once that pre-application is received, our team will have a look at it. If everything looks good from an eligibility standpoint, then we would invite you to submit a full application. One thing to note here is that if your pre-application has been approved, that doesn't mean that your project will be approved. It will go through a whole revision process. All right, and I will share the link in the chat just once I pass it on to Taryn to book a meeting with our outreach staff, just so you have it handy. All right. Required documents. There's a few that are required as part of this funding stream. So as we mentioned earlier, a climate risk assessment or an adaptation plan will have to be completed. So either at your community level, or if there is a climate adaptation strategy that was done regionally that is reflective, sorry, of your community's climate priorities, that may also be used. I would point you to the application guide for more information on that. So really, The key message here regarding required documents, I won't bore you through the details of what is needed and all of the things that are required at this stage of application. That's all included in our application guide. But really, a complete application saves a lot of time. So make sure that you have all the required docs, that your application submission is completed before you submit all of them, all of the your project, because that does save a lot of time for a team and it increases just the speed of the exchanges between our team and you. All right, and with that, I will pass it on to my colleague Taryn, who will talk to you about all the how and walk you through the key consideration and the common pitfalls.
Perfect. Thanks, Agath. We'll start with, we'll go to the next slide, please. We'll start with key considerations. So these are things to keep in mind in order to build a strong application. So if we've listed a few, there's obviously, it's a more comprehensive process, but these are the few that we wanted to highlight. So one of the main factors to consider is that the project should have a very clear scope and clear objectives. So this is one of the initial and primary criteria that we review when an application is submitted. Does it have a clear scope or focus? What is the project looking to do exactly? For implementation projects, which is sort of the focus of our presentation today, we want to see that the project demonstrates a high level of alignment with specific climate risks that are identified in a target area. So objectives must directly target the most pressing risks or show that the project is working to resolve actions that are identified in your municipal climate adaptation plan. Applications are going to be assessed on whether they have clear, specific, and evidence-based objectives related to reducing climate-related risks for at least one beneficiary. So that means it benefits either, it could be community well-being, it could be the ecosystem, or municipal systems or services. So there's a lot of factors there. One of the points that we noted in our first round of funding, which took place last year, is that applications didn't have sufficient project descriptions. So applicants tended not to take advantage of the full character limit in this section of the form and lacked a lot of detail and only provided kind of a few sentences describing the project. We encourage you to take advantage of that character count and add more detail, even if it's just detail about the community itself and how the project is going to benefit the community. We like the context, we like the story surrounding your project, so that information is valuable for us to have. So please do include that. With regards to the alignment with the climate action plan, the primary advice I would give here is that when you're filling out the application form, you'll see there's a section where you're able to check off specific climate risks. There should be a few sentences in your application elaborating on how you'll mitigate the risks that you check off. If you're not mitigating the risks that you check off as a part of that particular project, they shouldn't be checked off because we would consider that as incomplete. So if you're checking it off, you got to tell us how you're going to mitigate. Another tip would be to reference where in the action plan your project aligns with. So they could simply just be referencing a page number. This is more just convenience on our end so that we know exactly where you're taking, where that alignment is happening. So that could be helpful as well. Next slide. So I wanted to take time to give an overview of which factors can result in a higher score for an application. Higher score means more likely to be approved for funding when it comes to implementation projects. So the first point you see here is projects that address high and or very high risks, meaning that the project is aligned with one or more of the priority risks from the climate risk assessment or aligned very clearly with actions identified in your municipal climate adaptation plan. Majority of the evaluation marks for applications are in the risk reduction opportunity category. So it's important to thoroughly cover this in your application. The second point is demonstrated commitment to minimizing carbon emissions. So this is a bit of a tricky one because emissions aren't typically the focus of adaptation projects, but we do consider it an important component of a larger adaptation project. So I'll go over some examples of this in an upcoming slide. The third point we have is outlining the benefits of climate risk reduction for equity deserving or marginalized groups within your community. Again, I'll go into detail on how you can do this in your application, but it's an important point to consider when putting your application together. And then lastly, we have nature positive adaptation, which refers to strategies or actions that help that help communities adapt to climate risks while also protecting or restoring natural ecosystems. So enhancing biodiversity could be an example of this. Next slide. Weighted scores. So this is a table that's taken directly from our Adaptation and Action application guide, which is available on our funding webpage. So as I touched on in the previous slide, these are the criteria that are key to achieving a high scoring project. And you can see not every criteria is weighed equally. The most weight is attributed to the climate risk assessment or adaptation plan alignment. How well and clearly does your project align with risk assessment or your adaptation plan? So that's the basis of 70% of your score. And so that's why we encourage you to really put a lot of time and effort into demonstrating this in your application. The second one there is the benefits for equity deserving and marginalized communities and your engagement strategy. So that's about 20% of the score. And then nature positive adaptation and low carbon adaptation make up about 10% of the score. The bottom box there is just a list of factors that are going to be based on a pass-fail criteria. So they're not a part of the actual scoring, the 100% weighted score, but still considered very important. Okay, so why put so much time into these criteria? So one of the reasons you might consider incorporating them is not only for a higher score, but also because it could potentially result in a higher cost share for your project. So what this means is that a higher percentage of your eligible project costs would be covered by GMF funding. So this is where our cost share incentives come into play. For implementation projects, we cover up to 60% of total eligible project costs. However, the cost share could be increased if you're able to address these following strategic priorities in a meaningful way. So the first one is you could get additional 10% coverage of your project if it's an Indigenous community, or if it's a local government that's applying in partnership with an Indigenous community, or projects that involve collaboration between two or more municipal governments. In this case, a letter of support would be needed to access this incentive. The second 10% you see there is for rural or remote communities or municipalities with a population below 10,000. So we would just be looking at the census, the latest census results to determine that for the population. And then the third one we have is an additional 10% for projects that meaningfully address anti-racism, equity, and or reconciliation. So I'll go into some detail about that in an upcoming slide as well. And then lastly, we have 10% for projects that emphasize nature positive adaptation, which basically assesses whether the project demonstrates a commitment to integrating natural infrastructure where feasible within your project design. So enhancing green spaces could be an example of that. Each priority is stackable, and if you were able to meet all four of those priorities, you could receive up to 100% cost share on your eligible expensive. So I think this is a really good incentive to try and include these strategies as a part of your project. So this is a slide that we saw earlier in the presentation. I got highlighted this project, but I wanted to share an example of a project that received 100% of their eligible project costs covered, just to show that it's not impossible. This is a small community and it's a really cool project, so I thought worth highlighting again. So this is the village of Teslin. And it's a very remote community. They are home to a contingent of Indigenous peoples. And the project actually directly went to benefit the Indigenous community by protecting critical community infrastructure that they depend on for water and wastewater services. There was a slew of secondary benefits, but an important one being the development of an accessible trail that could be used by disabled or elderly Indigenous people of the community as well. And this was significant because a lot of the Indigenous elders with limited or reduced mobility couldn't access all the points. So that was hitting the equity mark for the cost share incentives. So just an example to show that it is possible to do. It just requires a bit of effort, but this is a cool project example. All right, common pitfalls. So since we've gone through one round of funding, there's a lot of lessons learned from the projects and applications that came through. And when reviewing previous applications, we were able to narrow down a few specific pitfalls or areas where applications were maybe not as strong as they could be. So areas of improvement. I want to go over some pitfalls with you, kind of the main standouts that we saw, and provide suggestions on how to avoid them and strengthen your responses in their regard. So the first is the engagement strategy. So this section we saw in the first batch of applications was relatively weak because most projects don't have their own dedicated engagement strategy. Oftentimes the strategy was mostly a description of the municipality's general engagement practices, and they didn't specify a specific strategy for the project itself. So what we're looking for in this section of the application is that the municipality has a meaningful engagement process involving all relevant stakeholders and rights holders, and that the project shows a commitment to building internal and or external support. This could be through ongoing engagement throughout the stages of the work of the project. It could mean consulting and engaging with community members. It could mean allowing for opportunities for the community to influence the project and to have targeted outreach strategies where you're reaching as many members of the community as possible. So there's just some tips on how you can kind of bulk up that part of your project application. The second would be the equity piece. Similarly to engagement, it was pretty weak across a lot of the applications that we received. People or clients, they described the equity considerations quite generically rather than specifying specific things that they were going to be doing. So what we're looking here is that your project demonstrates a more comprehensive and explicit focus on equity deserving groups. So when we think about equity deserving groups, they're communities that have historically maybe face systemic barriers to equal access or opportunities due to discrimination or marginalization. So examples could be Indigenous communities, low-income individuals, or people with disabilities. So projects should not only identify these groups in their community, but also try to incorporate targeted strategies to address their specific needs and vulnerabilities in the context of climate adaptation. What we saw in the last round of funding was projects claiming benefits for an entire population or an entire community or municipality, which sort of misses the point of equity considerations because it's having it's that certain populations that need that additional support that you're considering in your project. Next slide. So risk management. So we touched on risks and identifying risk earlier in the presentation, but I want to focus on specifically risk management here. And what I mean by risk management is it's the process of identifying, assessing, and then prioritizing risks, followed by coordinated efforts to minimize those risks and control the probability that they're going to impact the project. So these are risks associated with undertaking the project itself that I'm referring to, not necessarily climate risks. So a remarkably high number of the projects included a single risk in this section of the application form, just to kind of check that box off. But in reality, nearly every project should have a few just because they're sort of the baseline. For example, financial risks. So it's possible that your costs could increase and they're not budgeted for. So that's like an example of a potential financial risk. There could be scheduling risks. Timelines are changed or not met due to circumstances that can't be controlled, or result-based risks. So maybe the project's not going to achieve what the expected results are. So these are examples of the types of risks we're looking for you to include, and then also show how they will be mitigated. So to score high in this criteria, there should be no concerns with risk management of your project, where we feel that the applicant has suitably identified, assessed all relevant risks, and identified a mitigation plan that fits within the scope of the project. Lastly, we have carbon adaptation. So this section again was weak across a lot of our applications. And again, I mentioned this early in the slide. It's just because emissions are not going to necessarily be the primary focus of an adaptation project. We want to see that the project shows a commitment to minimizing carbon emissions and embodied carbon across all the stages. So it's not the easiest thing to address, but there are ways to do it. So some common approaches that could be considered include embodied carbon from the building materials, the role of natural infrastructure in carbon sequestration, using high efficiency equipment as a part of your project or during the implementation stage. Their backup power, so biofuel feedstocks, renewable natural gas, battery systems. These are just examples of things that could be incorporated into your project to hit the mark when it comes to low carbon adaptation or carbon emissions. So these were the four most common pitfalls or areas of improvement that were identified in the first round of applications. I do want to shout out the project officers who reviewed the applications and shared these insights with us. So hopefully you have a little bit more context in terms of how to create a strong application and what areas to focus on, so that when you submit your application, you can be confident that it's going to be approved for funding. So I think we have a bit of time for a Q&A. I think Charlene has been doing a great job addressing a lot of the questions coming in through the chat, but there are a few that are still unanswered. So maybe I'll read them, and if you want to field some of these with me.
Yeah, that sounds great.
All right. So the first one we have is, how long would this funding stream be available for? We would not be able to apply this year because we are planning to do our adaptation plan and risk assessment.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the LLC as a whole is an 8-year initiative. So there will be subsequent calls for applications. So if the timing this year feels a little bit too tight, there will be more calls for applications for implementation projects and also for if you're interested on the planning side of things. So more calls to come.
Perfect. Let me see. Oh, there's one in French. I'll let you read that.
Mhm. Yeah. Perfect. Donc, je vais lire la question en français ici. Pour les municipalités québécoises, est-ce qu'il faut déposer des demandes à travers des deux partenaires pour les deux volets? Études et mise en œuvre. Demande à travers des partenaires pour Oui, vous allez devoir. Donc, si vous souhaitez déposer pour une étude de faisabilité ou pour un projet de mise en œuvre, dans les deux cas, ça va devoir se faire à travers un partenaire non municipal. Donc, avec un conseil régional de l'environnement, par exemple, ou avec un organisme de bassin versant. Et ça s'applique là à la fois pour études de faisabilité et projets de mise en œuvre. All right. I want to give a shout out to Charlene, who's been firing off the answers to the Q&A here. So thank you so much, Charlene. I see we have another one here. So regarding the municipal resolution requirement for a non-municipal applicant, is inclusion of the resolution a requirement at time of application or just before funding can be provided? Yeah, do you want to speak to that one, Taryn, in
Um,
terms of the council resolution?
yeah, so we would want to receive the council resolution at the time that you submit your application. It would be a part of our application review to have that piece before we get to the approval of the funding. So that's just a part of that application package, sorry, that you would be submitting at the jump of the process.
And Taryn, just for the council resolution, if the timing is a little bit too tight, can applicants submit that a little bit after their full project submission?
We would possibly, maybe with discussion, be able to continue the review of the full application once it's submitted. But in terms of moving on from that review, we would want to make sure we receive that resolution prior to moving forward from that step. So you can work with whoever's reviewing your application to figure out timelines and be flexible. That's what we're here to. We're here to help you with your application, not stop. So if you feel like you need more time for certain pieces, you can always reach out to us and we can figure those things out just based on your project needs.
Awesome.
I
There was
guess
a question
we
in the chat as well that I saw. I don't know if it was addressed or not, but it said, I requested the pre-application through the portal. How long before receiving the pre-application form?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, essentially, in the funding portal, the pre-application should already be in there. So it's a bit of a more of a self-serve. So once you're in the funding portal, you'll be able to access the pre-application. I will say though, for everyone on the call, that our funding portal has gone through a major revamp. So you may be asked to, you'll be prompted to re-register to the funding portal to access the pre-application and application materials. And there
Another,
was one, oh, sorry, go ahead, Taryn.
no, I was just gonna say, I'll ask it this one to you again then.
Yeah.
Is there a partial funding option or is it all or nothing, i.e. 60% or nothing?
So 60% would be the baseline. So if your project is approved, then we'd start by the 60% baseline. And depending on the strategic priorities that your project meets, that could be increased up to 100%. So as Taryn spoke about, so there are stackable incentives. So if your project is looking at incorporating a nature positive solution, then you might qualify for an extra 10% bump up. One thing to note though is that some of the stackable cost share incentives are determined at the point of peer review application or peer review. So you won't be able to assume that cost incentive from the get-go. You'd really have to wait for the peer review. And that's specifically for the cost share incentive related to nature positive adaptation and the cost share related to a project that meaningfully addresses anti-racism, equity, and inclusion. So those two incentives would be determined at point of evaluation. One question also that I saw pop up in the chat and I want to speak to just for a little bit. So someone was asking about the possibility to combine certain of FCM's funding. So there is a possibility with adaptation and action for you to, if your project is looking at also planting trees, there's also a way for you to submit a joint application, meaning that you would be able to benefit from two different funding streams. So the Adaptation and Action funding stream and the Growing Canada's Community Canopy funding stream. So essentially, if your project is a climate adaptation project that has tree planting costs over the $50,000 mark, that's when you would want to consider applying for a joint application. But really kind of that pivoting point is if your project has tree planting costs over the $50 million mark.
There's another question here. It says, I would like to apply, but I don't see the apply button on the FCM website. It says I am under general public. So in order to apply, whether that's for LLCA funding or any type of green municipal fund initiatives, we have a funding portal, and maybe we can put the link in the chat for the funding portal, where you can apply for all of our funding initiatives, including LLCA. And so once you log in and or if you don't have an account, you would just register for one. Once you have access, all the pre-application forms should be available there for you to submit. If you're interested, you can always chat with one of our outreach advisors beforehand to make sure your project's eligible before actually putting in the work into that pre-application. But we'll share the link to that portal with you, and then you should be able to create an account, log in, and submit a pre-application.
Thanks, Sharon. I'm putting it in the chat as we speak, the funding portal link.
Okay.
And yeah, just to reinforce what Taryn was mentioning, really take advantage of the services that we offer in terms of helping you scope your project, making sure that it meets the eligibility criteria just before putting the work in the pre-application and all of that. I would encourage you to reach out to our staff to discuss your project and see if it's a good fit. Okay, I see that there are two other questions here. Uh, Great. I'll maybe speak to the one here in French. So I'll read it out loud. Puisque la réduction des CO2 est un critère important dans la sélection de projet, comment démontrer ces critères pour les projets d'inondation, par exemple? Euh, donc, c'est une bonne question. Dans le fond, si ça se prête bien, donc si votre projet se prête bien à réduire aussi les émissions, on va être intéressé à savoir. C'est certain
Also
qu'il y a
will
peut-être certains
reduce
projets qui vont être un peu
emissions.
moins bien.
Of course, there will be projects that don't
Ce
lend
qu'on
themselves
souhaite
as easily to
savoir avec ces
that.
critères
But what
d'évaluation-là,
we'll be able to
c'est
do with these
est-ce qu'il y a la possibilité
evaluation
dans votre
criteria
projet de
is to
venir
see is whether there's a
réduire
possibility in your project
les
to
émissions de
reduce
gaz à effet de serre?
CO2
Si oui,
emissions.
nous démontrer là,
If
comment
that's
vous souhaiteriez
possible,
vous y prendre pour réduire
we
ça.
you need to
Et si le
describe how you're going
projet,
to
ça
do
se peut dans
that.
certains cas là, que le
And in
projet là, se
some
prête
cases,
moins bien.
the
Pour
project
un projet
will
d'inondation, vous
not
pouvez
lend itself as
considérer là,
well.
la
For a
technique que
project
vous
focused
souhaitez
on
utiliser. Est-ce
flooding, you
qu'il y a
can look
la
at the technique you
possibilité
want
là, de
to,
venir
the
réduire le
approach you want to
GS au niveau
use,
vos
and
techniques
whether
de
that also
production ou quoi que
includes
ce soit. Je ne sais pas vraiment ça, ce n'est pas le projet
CO2 emission
d'inondation, mais je
reductions,
vous inviterai
perhaps
à
in your
explorer
construction
les
materials.
pistes. Par exemple,
You
si
could
vous mettez en place là, certaines
explore
techniques de
different
construction, voir
avenues.
s'il y a possibilité de
Construction
réduire les
techniques
GS en
and
lien avec ça.
materials might allow you to reduce emissions as part of your flood reduction
Okay, I see
project.
another question here from Chelsea. If my community is only eligible for one implementation project, can I apply for multiple projects in hope of one getting approved? Yeah, that's a great question. So the answer is yes, if you submit multiple projects, the one that is highest scoring will be the one that is approved. However, for feasibility study, it's a little bit different, is if you submit multiple feasibility studies, since it's a first come, first served basis, it would be the first one that meets the criteria that we receive that would receive funding. I don't know, Taryn, if you want to add anything from a funding standpoint here.
Yeah, for the implementation projects, I would say that if there's a certain project that is the most critical for your community, maybe connect with one of our outreach advisors first so that you can shape your application in a way that you can be confident that it will get approved, as opposed to kind of just putting in a bunch of applications with hopes that one will get approved. We can help you tailor that application and make it strong. That's what the outreach team is here for, so that you're not putting all your efforts into multiple, maybe focused on one that you really care about or is very important or high risk or whatever it is. That would be my suggestion for you. Okay, actually perfect timing because we are at the end of the Q&A period. If you do have any other questions, we'll give you some contact information so you can reach out to us. So we've gone over some funding opportunities. We've heard about some projects that we've helped fund. And if you're wondering how you can access funding for your own projects, please feel free to use the QR codes there to access information regarding the funding initiatives. So we have the first one is the LLC funding webpage, so just the general funding webpage. The second one on the left-hand side is the implementation project webpage. So if you're looking for more information regarding specifically implementation projects, how to apply, the application guide, all of that will be linked there. And then the third one on the left-hand side there is the Adaptation and Action resource library. And so there you can find a lot of other trainings and tools and resources to help you either just learn about the initiative or help shape your application as well. And then on the right-hand side there, if you're looking to connect with our outreach team, maybe you have a project that you aren't sure if it's a good fit or not, or you just want to learn a little more, you can use that to book a meeting with them, and they'll be more than happy to speak with you. You can also contact us if we go to the next slide. You can also connect with us through our generic email address here. It's sort of our info box, so gmfinfo@fcm.ca, or using that phone number. Those emails get sent to us or to the outreach team to respond to. So we will get back to you if you prefer to reach out via email. And if you're just looking to stay up to date on our funding, whether it's adaptation or otherwise, training and other resources, I would encourage you to subscribe to FCM Connect, and you will get updates on all of those things. Yeah, that's it for this. One more slide, I get.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, thanks again everyone for all your great questions and thanks again for attending today's webinar. We'd like to invite you to our next one, which is happening this week on Thursday, and it will be on community partnership for equitable local climate action. And that's happening. So again, this week, Thursday, July 24th at 2 p.m. And I see Ansha has popped up a quick 30-second survey. So I'll let you a few moments to take 30 seconds to answer the survey. And again, thank you so much for coming and feel free to reach out to our team if you have any questions that weren't answered or if you'd like to further chat about your project. Again, application deadline for the first round of implementation project is August 19th, and there will be a second one happening right after. So yeah, thanks again, everyone, and feel free to reach out with any questions. And we'll stay on the line just a few more seconds to give you some time to answer the webinar survey. Oh, a few more seconds, a few more minutes. No rush.